Welcome back to Classic Stories and Fairy Tales. I am your host and narrator, Jerry Coble, and we are continuing in our journey through the book Cranford by Elizabeth C. Gaskell. Now today we are going to be reading Chapter 11 and Chapter 12. So let's get started with Chapter 11, titled Samuel Brown. The next morning I met Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole setting out on a long walk to find some old woman who was famous in the neighborhood for her skill in knitting woolen stockings. Miss Pole said to me, with a smile half kindly and half contemptuous upon her countenance, "I have been just telling Lady Glenmire of our poor friend Mrs. Forrester and her terror of ghosts. It comes from living so much alone and listening to the bugaboo stories of that Jenny of hers. She was so calm and so much above superstitious fears herself that I was almost ashamed to say how glad I had been of her Headingley Causeway proposition the night before, and turned off the conversation to something else." In the afternoon, Miss Pole called on Miss Matty to tell her of the adventure, the real adventure they had met with on their morning's walk. They had been perplexed about the exact path which they were to take across the fields in order to find the knitting old woman, and had stopped to inquire at a little wayside public house, standing on the high road to London, about 3 miles from Cranford. The good woman had asked them to sit down and rest themselves while she fetched her husband, who could direct them better than she could. And, while they were sitting in the sanded parlor, a little girl came in. They thought that she belonged to the landlady, and began some trifling conversation with her. But, on Miss Roberts' return, she told them that the little thing was the only child of a couple who were staying in the house. And then she began a long story, out of which Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole could only gather 1 or 2 decided facts, which were that, about 6 weeks ago, a light spring cart had broken down just before their door, in which there were 2 men, 1 woman, and this child. One of the men was seriously hurt. No bones broken, only shaken, the landlady called it. But he had probably sustained some severe internal injury, for he had languished in their house ever since, attended by his wife, the mother of this little girl. Miss Pole had asked what he was, what he looked like, and Miss Roberts had made answer that he was not like a gentleman, nor yet like a common person. If it had not been that he and his wife were such decent, quiet people, she could almost have thought he was a mountebank, or something of that kind, for they had a great box in the cart, full of she did not know what. She had helped to unpack it and take out their linen and clothes, when the other man, his twin brother, she believed he was, had gone off with the horse and cart. Miss Pole had begun to have her suspicions at this point, and expressed her idea that it was rather strange that the box and cart and horse and all should have disappeared. But good Miss Roberts seemed to have become quite indignant at Miss Pole's implied suggestion. In fact, Miss Pole said she was as angry as if Miss Pole had told her that she herself was a swindler. As the best way of convincing the ladies, she bethought her of begging them to see the wife, and, as Miss Pole said, there was no doubting the honest, worn, bronzed face of the woman, who at the first tender word from Lady Glenmire burst into tears, which she was too weak to check until some word from the landlady made her swallow down her sobs, in order that she might testify to the Christian kindness shown by Mr. and Miss Roberts. Miss Pole came round with the swing to as vehement a belief in the sorrowful tale as she had been skeptical before, and, as a proof of this, her energy in the poor sufferer's behalf was nothing daunted when she found out that he, and no other, was our Signor Bernoni, to whom all Cranford had been attributing all manners of evil this 6 weeks past. Yes, his wife said his proper name was Samuel Brown. Sam, she called him, but to the last we preferred calling him the Signor. It sounded so much better. The end of their conversation with the Signora Bernoni was that it was agreed that he should be placed under medical advice, and for any expense incurred in procuring this, Lady Glenmire promised to hold herself responsible, and had accordingly gone to Mr. Hoggins to beg him to ride over to the Rising Sun that very afternoon, and examine into the Signor's real state. And, as Miss Pole said, if it was desirable to remove him to Cranford to be more immediately under Mr. Hoggins' eye, she would undertake to see for lodgings and arrange about the rent. Miss Roberts had been as kind as could be all throughout, but it was evident that their long residence there had been a slight inconvenience. Before Miss Pole left us, Miss Matty and I were as full of the morning's adventure as she was. We talked about it all the evening, turning it in every possible light, and we went to bed anxious for the morning, when we should surely hear from someone what Mr. Hoggins thought and recommended. For, as Miss Matty observed, though Mr. Hoggins did say "Jack's up," a fig for his heels, and called preference pref, she believed he was a very worthy man and a very clever surgeon. Indeed, we were rather proud of our doctor at Cranford as a doctor. We often wished, when we heard of Queen Adelaide or the Duke of Wellington being ill, that they would send for Mr. Hoggins. But, on consideration, we were rather glad they did not. For, if they were ailing, what should we do if Mr. Hoggins had been appointed physician in ordinary to the royal family? As a surgeon, we were proud of him, but as a man, or rather, I should say, as a gentleman, we could only shake our heads over his name and himself, and wish that he had read Lord Chesterfield's letters in the days when his manners were susceptible of improvement. Nevertheless, we all regarded his dictum in the signor's case as infallible, and when he said that with care and attention he might rally, we had no more fear for him. But although we had no more fear, everybody did as much as if there was great cause for anxiety, as indeed there was until Mr. Hoggins took charge of him. Miss Pole looked out clean and comfortable, if homely, lodgings. Miss Matty sent the sedan chair for him, and Martha and I aired it well before it left Cranford by holding a warm pan full of red-hot coals in it, and then shutting it up close, smoke and all, until the time when he should get into it at the rising sun. Lady Glenmire undertook the medical department under Mr. Hoggins' directions, and rummaged up all Miss Jamieson's medicine glasses and spoons and bed tables in a free and easy way that made Miss Matty feel a little anxious as to what that lady and Mr. Molnar might say if they knew. Miss Forrester made some of the bread jelly, for which she was so famous, to have ready as a refreshment in the lodgings when he should arrive. A present of this bread jelly was the highest mark of favor dear Miss Forrester could confer. Miss Pole had once asked her for the receipt, but she had met with a very decided rebuff. That lady told her that she could not part with it to anyone during her life, and that after her death it was bequeathed, as her executors would find, to Miss Matty. What Miss Matty, or as Miss Forrester calls her, remembering the clause in her will and the dignity of the occasion, Miss Matilda Jenkyns, might choose to do with the receipt when it came into her possession, whether to make it public or to hand it down as an heirloom, she did not know, nor would she dictate. And a mold of this admirable, digestible, unique bread jelly was sent by Miss Forrester to our poor sick conjurer. Who says that the aristocracy are proud? Here was a lady by birth a Tyrrell, and descended from the great Sir Walter that shot King Rufus, and in whose veins ran the blood of him who murdered the little princess in the Tower, going every day to see what dainty dishes she could prepare for Samuel Brown, a mountebank. But indeed it was wonderful to see what kind feelings were called out by this poor man's coming amongst us, and also wonderful to see how the great Cranford panic, which had been occasioned by his first coming in his Turkish dress, melted away into thin air on his second coming, pale and feeble, and with his heavy, filmy eyes that only brightened a very little when they fell upon the countenance of his faithful wife, or their pale and sorrowful little girl. Somehow we all forgot to be afraid. I dare say it was that finding out that he, who had first excited our love of the marvelous by his unprecedented arts, had not sufficient everyday gifts to manage a shying horse, made us feel as if we were ourselves again. Miss Pole came with her little basket at all hours of the evening, as if her lonely house and the unfrequented road to it had never been infested by that murderous gang. Miss Forrester said she thought that neither Jenny nor she need mind the headless lady who wept and wailed in Darkness Lane, for surely the power was never given to such beings to harm those who went about to try to do what little good was in their power, to which Jenny trembling assented. But the mistress's theory had little effect on the maid's practice, until she had sewn 2 pieces of red flannel in the shape of a cross on her inner garment. I found Miss Matty covering her penny ball, the ball that she used to roll under the bed, with gay colored worsted and rainbow stripes. "My dear," said she, "my heart is sad for that little careworn child. Although her father is a conjurer, she looks as if she had never had a good game of play in her life. I used to make very pretty balls in this way when I was a girl, and I thought I would try if I could not make this one smart and take it to Phoebe this afternoon. I think the gang must have left the neighborhood, for one does not hear any more of their violence and robbery now. We were all of us far too full of the signor's precarious state to talk either about robbers or ghosts. Indeed, Lady Glenmire said she never had heard of any actual robberies, except that 2 little boys had stolen some apples from Farmer Benson's orchard, and that some eggs had been missed on a market day off Widow Hayward's stall. But that was expecting too much of us. We could not acknowledge that we had only had this small foundation for all our panic. Miss Pole drew herself up at this remark of Lady Glenmire's, and said that she wished that she could agree with her as to the very small reason we had had for alarm, but with the recollection of a man disguised as a woman who had endeavored to force himself into her house while his confederates waited outside, with the knowledge gained from Lady Glenmire herself of the footprints seen on Miss Jameson's flower borders, with the fact before her of the audacious robbery committed on Mr. Hoggins at his own door. But here Lady Glenmire broke in with a very strong expression of doubt as to whether this last story was not an entire fabrication founded upon the theft of a cat. She grew so red while she was saying all this that I was not surprised at Miss Pole's manner of bridling up, and I am certain if Lady Glenmire had not been her ladyship, we should have had more emphatic contradiction than the "well, to be sure," and similar fragmentary ejaculations which were all that she ventured upon in my lady's presence. But when she was gone, Miss Pole began a long congratulation to Miss Matty that so far they had escaped marriage, which she noticed always made people credulous to the last degree. Indeed, she thought it argued great natural credulity in a woman if she could not keep herself from being married. And in what Lady Glenmire had said about Mr. Hoggins' robbery, we had a specimen of what people came to if they gave way to such a weakness. Evidently, Lady Glenmire would swallow anything if she could believe the poor vamped-up story about a neck of mutton and a pussy with which he had tried to impose on Miss Pole. Only she had always been on her guard against believing too much of what men said. We were thankful, as Miss Pole desired us to be, that we had never been married, but I think, of the 2, we were even more thankful that the robbers had left Cranford. At least I judged so from a speech of Miss Matty's that evening, as we sat over the fire, in which she evidently looked upon a husband as a great protector against thieves, burglars, and ghosts, and said that she did not think that she should dare to be always warning young people against matrimony, as Miss Pole did continually. To be sure, marriage was a risk, as she saw. Now she had some experience, but she remembered the time when she had looked forward to being married as much as anyone. "Not to any particular person, my dear," said she, hastily checking herself up, as if she were afraid of having admitted too much. "Only the old story, you know, of ladies always saying, 'when I marry,' and 'gentlemen, if I marry.' It was a joke spoken in rather a sad tone, and I doubt if either of us smiled, but I could not see Miss Matty's face by the flickering firelight. In a little while she continued, 'But, after all, I have not told you the truth. It is so long ago, and no one ever knew how much I thought of it at the time, unless, indeed, my dear mother guessed. But I may say that there was a time when I did not think I should have been only Miss Matty Jenkyns all my life. For even if I did meet with anyone who wished to marry me now, and as Miss Pole says, one is never too safe, I could not take him. I hope he would not take it too much to heart, but I could not take him, or anyone but the person I once thought I should be married to. And he is dead and gone, and he never knew how it all came about that I said no, when I had thought many and many a time, well, it's no matter what I thought. God ordains it all.